From 1858 to 1947, India was ruled by the British Crown as part of British India. In the 1800s, Britain sought to fix the borders of British India with the other great regional powers, the Russian Empire and the Chinese Empire. With the Chinese Empire, which was then ruled by a monarchy, Britain wanted to define British India's borders in Kashmir in the north with China's Xinjiang province, and British India's borders in the east with Tibet, thereby establishing a common border with China. In 1865, a British land survey issued the Johnson Line, which put the border of Kashmir as including the Aksai Chin region, a 37,000 square kilometer, barren, uninhabited, high-altitude desert. In 1899, Britain proposed a new border with China called the McCartney-MacDonald Line, but it received no response from the Chinese government. Britain used the McCartney-MacDonald Line as British India's border up until 1908. By the 1920s, Britain was publishing its maps using the Johnson Line as the Kashmir-Xinjiang border. Similarly, Britain took steps to establish British India's borders with Tibet and China. Negotiations led to the 1914 Shimla Accord, which was signed by Tibetan and British representatives and which established the McMahon Line as the border between British India and Tibet. The McMahon Line placed some 80,000 square kilometers as part of British India, which was later administered as the Northeast Frontier Agency, or NEFA. The Chinese government rejected the Shimla Accord, stating that Tibet, which it asserted was part of China, could not enter into treaties with foreign governments. Britain was also initially adverse to implementing the Shimla Accord, but by the 1930s, the British government had begun to use the McMahon Line in its maps of British India. In August 1947, India became an independent country. Meanwhile, China faced a multitude of conflicts for much of the first half of the 20th century. But in 1949, Chinese communists established the People's Republic of China, or PRC. Initially, the governments of India and China sought to cultivate strong bilateral relations. In the early 1950s, a series of diplomatic and cultural exchanges led in April 1954 to the Panchil Treaty, which was meant to form the basis for good relations between India and China. However, with their poorly defined border, relations between China and India began to deteriorate. Both countries claimed ownership over Aksai Chin and Nefa. India released maps that essentially duplicated the British-era maps which showed both areas as part of India. China also claimed sovereignty over these areas and stated that as it had not signed any border treaties with the former British Indian government, the India-China border must be resolved through new negotiations. Sino-Indian relations deteriorated further because of two other events. First, in the 1950s, China built a road through Aksai Chin that linked Xinjiang and Tibet. Second, in 1959, following a failed Tibetan uprising against the Chinese occupation forces in Tibet, India provided refuge for the Dalai Lama, Tibet's political and spiritual leader. Earlier in 1950, China had invaded and annexed Tibet. The Indian government had hoped that Tibet would remain an independent state and a buffer zone between India and China as it had been in the colonial era. But in the early 1950s period of Sino-Indian friendly relations, India did not oppose Chinese military action in Tibet. To curb their deteriorating relations, China proposed that in exchange for China dropping its claim to Nefa, India would do the same for Aksai Chin. However, India was unwilling to negotiate on the basis of ceding territory. By the early 1960s, the emerging crisis had turned confrontational. The Chinese military established outposts in Aksai Chin, which was countered by the Indian Army implementing the forward policy, the setting up of forward outposts in unoccupied areas. Furthermore, in September 1962, the Indian Army set up several outposts north of the McMahon Line, following earlier patrols that discovered that the Thagla Ridge lay north of the line. This action ran contrary to the 1914 Shimla Accord, which created the McMahon Line. However, the Indian government believed that the accord had as its original intent setting the region's natural barrier, which was the Thagla Ridge, as the border between Tibet and British India. By mid-1962, with Aksai Chin and the areas north of the McMahon Line bristling with fortified outposts, skirmishes between Indian and Chinese units began to break out in September and October 1962. By early October 1962, unbeknownst to India, China had begun preparing for war. Historians point to two reasons for China's decision to go to war. One, the Chinese government viewed India as a threat to Chinese rule in Tibet, as evidenced by the Indian government giving the Dalai Lama refuge in India. And two, China was seeking reprisal for India's forward policy, which the Chinese government said was nibbling away at Chinese territory. Furthermore, India's then friendly relations with the United States and the Soviet Union, as well as China's broken ties with the Soviet Union following the Sino-Soviet split, were viewed by the Chinese government as a plot to encircle and isolate China. The Chinese war plan involved concentrated offensive operations consisting of large numbers of troops, particularly at Nepha, which would form the eastern sector, and to a lesser extent at Aksai Chin, which would form the western sector. On October 18, 1962, the Chinese government gave the order to go to war on October 20th. Troops, weapons, and military equipment were brought in. Some 80,000 Chinese troops would take part in the war. By contrast, the Indian military was unprepared for war, with some generals even stating that a war with China was highly unlikely. Some 15,000 to 20,000 Indian soldiers would be involved in the war. Fighting broke out on October 20, 1962, with Chinese forces launching offensives in two main areas, in the eastern sector, Nepha, north of the McMahon Line, and in the western sector in Aksai Chin. Some fighting also occurred in the Nathula Pass in Sikkim near the China-Indian border. The Chinese government called the operation a self-defensive counterattack, implying that India had started the war by crossing north of the McMahon Line. In the eastern sector, preceding an artillery barrage of Indian positions, 3 regiments of Chinese troops swept down on the 1 battalion of the Indian Army defending southern Thagla and gained control of the south side of the Namkachu River. To avoid encirclement, the Indians retreated across the McMahon Line. Chinese forces crossed south into Nepha and captured Tawang. On October 26, 1962, the Chinese also began an artillery barrage of Walong, located at the eastern end of Nepha near the Indian-Burmese border. In the western sector, at the start of the war, Chinese forces already controlled a greater portion of Aksai Chin. The Chinese military action, therefore, focused on overrunning the many scattered Indian outposts across Aksai Chin. By October 22, 1962, Chinese forces had gained full control of Aksai Chin, overcoming Indian resistance in the Chip Chap Valley, Galwan Valley, and Pangong Lake. On October 24, 1962, or 4 days into the war, China ordered its forces to stop advancing. China proposed to India the following: 1. An end to the fighting and the mutual withdrawal of forces to a distance of 20 kilometers from their present positions. 2. A Chinese withdrawal from Nepha. And 3. A negotiated settlement of the border dispute. India objected to the mutual 20-kilometer withdrawal of forces, stating that Chinese forces had advanced 40 to 60 kilometers and proposed that both sides retreat to positions before September 8, 1962, that is, to their pre-war positions. On November 4, 1962, China again stated that it would relinquish its claim to Nepha in exchange for India doing the same for Aksai Chin as previously offered. On November 14th, India rejected the offer. Fighting resumed on November 14, 1962. In the eastern sector, Chinese forces advanced toward Sela and Bomdila and bypassed strong Indian positions at Sela to take Bomdila and Thembang. Chinese forces then advanced south towards Assam and came to within 30 kilometers of Tezpur. On November 16th, Chinese forces captured Walong. In the western sector, the Chinese cleared Aksai Chin of the remaining Indian Army units. By this time, the Indian Army's defenses at Nepha and Aksai Chin had ceased to exist. On November 19, 1962, China declared a unilateral ceasefire, which took effect 2 days later, November 21st, when Chinese forces withdrew 20 kilometers from their most advanced positions. The war was a resounding victory for the Chinese military, which it achieved using speed and surprise, concentration of force, innovative and flexible tactics, efficient logistics, and mastery of terrain and weather conditions. By contrast, the Indian Army suffered from poor military leadership, insufficient logistics, inadequate defense, and weak strategy. China gained full control of Aksai Chin but withdrew its forces from Nepha, allowing the Indian government to re-establish its authority there. For India, the war had a profound effect. The government was severely criticized for its pacifist attitude toward China. India-China relations deteriorated and the rise of nationalism and anti-Chinese sentiment arose in India. India launched a full review of its military infrastructure and capacity, and in the period that followed, the Indian Army underwent major improvements. Manpower strength was increased, military doctrine and organizational structure were revised, and modern weapons were purchased. The India-China border issue has since remained unresolved, with the Line of Actual Control, or LAC, serving as the de facto India-China border in Aksai Chin and Nefa. At Nefa, the LAC is equivalent to the McMahon Line. In the years following the war, a number of skirmishes and border incidents have occurred between Indian and Chinese forces. In 1975, Sikkim was incorporated as an Indian state. In December 1986, tensions rose when India turned Nefa into a constituent state named Arunachal Pradesh.